think it was like 62% or 63% said, no matter what evidence you gave me, I will never change. But yet all of them did. So that begs the question, what happened? What would it take for them to become open to even the possibility of considering something outside of naturalism, atheism?
Welcome to the podcast. If you're doubting or deconstructing your faith, you're in the right place. This podcast makes space for doubting Christians to be totally honest about doubt while still being hopeful about faith. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Jana Harmon, author of Atheists Finding God. For her PhD research, she interviewed 50 former atheists who had all converted to Christianity because she wanted to know, what would it take for an atheist to believe? I thought that topic might be of interest to those who are wondering about themselves. What would it take for me to believe? I also wanted to have Dr. Harmon on the podcast because she has spent countless hours considering what motivates people to make life-altering changes to their worldview. So stick around to the end to hear Dr. Harmon's heartfelt advice to those who are wrestling with doubt. Enjoy the conversation.
Well, Matt, I usually am on your side of the microphone. I do host a podcast, and so I am very interested in what other people think and their experiences in life, their journeying, especially away from and towards faith. I just am curious about people, and I want to know why they believe or reject God. What are all of the reasons for that? What makes someone open to change their point of view and their worldview? I'm just very curious about ideas and how they apply in people's lives, basically.
Specifically, your research for your PhD and also the book that you wrote, Atheists Finding God, has to do with atheists converting to Christianity, which is a really interesting subject. What initially made you interested in that? Is it just what you said, like you wanted to know their motivations, or was it something else?
Well, Matt, I actually got a degree in apologetics, and it seemed very, hard and shut case, very convincing with regard to the substance of the Christian worldview. It was logical, it was rational, there was a lot of evidence I felt for it. It was cumulative, there's this large case for Christianity. And yet, out in the real world, the evidence for Christianity just seemed to be dismissed out of hand especially in the case of an atheist. They wouldn't even look at it. They would say there was no evidence for God. And I thought, after 3 years of study, well, yes, there is. What's going on? And so I wanted to ask the question, essentially, what would it take for an atheist to become a Christian? There's more to this picture than just the rationality of belief, which sometimes apologetics has been reduced to a rational project. And we know that we do make our decisions a lot more often for non-rational reasons than sitting down with a proposition and studying it and determining whether or not it's true before we move forward. I wanted a fuller, more human picture, I guess. And so it drove me to ask this broader question.
And that makes sense because our faith is not just about intellectual assent. Like there's actually like an emotional, relational, spiritual thing happening. So what was the central question of your PhD?
The more academic way to phrase it was to really look at the holistic nature of belief. What are the motivations and influences that cause someone to move away from God, claim atheism as their identity, as their belief? And again, what would open them to the possibility of something beyond atheism towards God? How would they pursue that? How would they quest after that? In the academic world, religion is reduced to nothing more than a psychological or social phenomenon, where people belong and they believe the same things and they practice the same things. And it serves what they would call a functional purpose. That is, religion works for them in some ways, but it has nothing to do with truth. But for me, it has everything to do with truth and function. So as Os Guinness says, Christianity works because it's true. It's not true because it works.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there's this holistic part that all of academia was missing. In this particular demographic, the atheist, at the end of the day, they wouldn't believe unless they believed it were true, unless God was real, unless Christianity was true. So I, again, just wanted to get a very full picture of what it would take for an atheist to become a Christian in a very holistic way, head, heart, life, everything.
I love that you're trying to bring together, yeah, holistic. That's the only word that really works, is like a whole life, which involves the intellectual and emotional and social and spiritual. So we're going to get to that in a sec. I want to dive into the nitty gritty of really trying to understand the research you did. But just before we get to that, I'm just kind of curious about like your personal opinion, having done this work. Like, is there something about the research that you did that you're particularly proud of or didn't expect to find while digging?
Proud of and didn't expect. Those are two different things. Proud of, as I mentioned, this work was a pushback against the academy in the sense that they come at it from a very naturalistic or secularistic worldview. So religion is pie in the sky. And I was contending for something quite different, quite substantive, quite real. If atheists became believers because it was absolutely true, if that was a reason why they came to faith, that had to be part of the research. It couldn't be excluded. So that was something that I contended for at great cost. Something that surprised me, I think, I would say two things here. One is, speaking of God engaging or interacting, were the accounts of spiritual experiences that took place in the lives of non-believers. That was very surprising to me. I am not of a more charismatic background. I'm not expecting those kinds of things, particularly in these journeying. I mean, these journeys, you hear of them maybe among the Muslim population, that Jesus shows up in a dream or something like that. But that was something I did not expect. Although, as a Christian, as a believer, we should, right? We totally should. So that was one thing. And I think the other thing that surprised me most of all was the passionate nature of the convert. It seemed to me that there was almost a direct relationship between the passionate nature of anti-belief or disbelief to the strength and the passion that they have for Christ afterwards. This group of individuals that I researched, 50 former atheists, were just all in, completely transformed, giving their life. They're just the most beautiful, winsome ambassadors for Christ that I know.
Yeah, it is exciting. So what I'd love to do is I'd like to pivot, if you don't mind, towards just really trying to wrap our heads around the finding of your research. And I want to ask some questions to help us kind of understand the bulk of what it was you presented in your book, which I'm assuming that represents your PhD work, like in a summary form. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
If you don't mind, you started your book by talking about different definitions of atheism. And since kind of your core question revolves around what it would take for an atheist to believe, could you lay out those different definitions and how you think it might influence people's commitment to their atheism as a starting point?
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. There are two primary ways that people relate to atheism or themselves as atheists. The more academic affirmation of atheism is a positive declaration that God does not exist. And that's what you'll see again among the educated atheists who like Graham Oppy would say, the natural world is all there is, and it's formed by natural causes, and he's willing to go out there on a limb and make that declaration. And it's clear. And I think that's a more honest way to go, honestly. But there is the more common use of atheism these days. You'll see it even on most social media posts or whatever. People will just say, I merely lack a belief in God. That is seen as in an academic terms, a more weak or weaker view of atheism. They would say, I don't believe in God, just like I don't believe in Santa Claus or tooth fairy or whatever. I don't have to prove anything, is what they would say. It's not an explicit statement of disbelief in terms of I know that God does not exist, but it is an implicit statement of what they do believe. They do believe that the only thing that exists is the natural world. So, although they think that in some ways they're removing a burden of proof from themselves by just saying, I lack a belief and the proof is all on the Christian to prove it, they do have a burden of proof to prove their own naturalism, why they believe it, and how it informs all of reality. So, either it's the stronger version or the weaker version.
Do you find that most atheists that you interviewed, do they have that kind of stronger form of atheism where it's I'm saying there is no God, or were for the most part, were they kind of this like I lack a belief in God approach?
Of these 50 atheists, the way that it was broken down is about 2/3, 67% were of the stronger ilk of I'm declaring there is no God. And about 10% were strongly anti-theist. They didn't believe in God and they didn't want anybody else to believe in God either. And then 1/3 were of the weaker lack of belief, and about 10% or 10% total were more apatheist. They lacked a belief and they really didn't care about the whole thing. So yeah,
That's quite a diversity. I guess I didn't quite expect that. Did they each have kind of a different level of commitment to their atheism depending on how they approached it to begin with?
There were half of the people in my study who grew up culturally without God in their immediate world. That is, it wasn't in their family, it wasn't among their friends, in their culture so much as perhaps maybe nominally in old vacant churches or something like that. There are some people who just grow up without it. It's a non-issue. And so I would say that their commitment level, it wasn't as strong. But then there are some, on the intellectual side who were very committed to it in a more quiet, substantive way, like I believe in science, not fairy tales, and so there was that kind of commitment that was less emotional. But I will say 2/3 of them, I think it was like 62% or 63% said, no matter what evidence you gave me, I will never change. That's a pretty solid commitment, but yet all of them did. So that begs the question, what happened despite this heavy, high level commitment level to atheism?
I asked kind of more generally dependent on their definitions of atheism, what their commitment to atheism was like. I don't know if you just wanted to like comment on that more generally. Are there just kind of more general trends of why they were committed to atheism that you want to touch on just before we move on?
Yeah. Yes, of course. Let's just say that in looking at that question, what are the motivations or the influences, the factors that cause you to form that belief and that identity? And there were such a variety. I mentioned the fact that in some cultural settings, it's just absent. So it's irrelevant. They're fine without God. Don't need God, what I would call the happy atheist. There was often this, what I think, a false dichotomy that was presented that either you believe in science or God, you can't do both. And so many of them just pursued that, based upon an educational experience or authority. Some are atheists because of life experience. We know that the problem of evil and suffering is probably the most prevalent question or pushback against God. If life isn't good and you're supposed to be good and powerful, why is my life this way? The first story in my book is a man who at age 7 lost his brother because of a house fire, and he knew he couldn't believe in God after that. Or another person who had never prayed to God, but his mother was on her deathbed. He prayed and she died. So, where was God? So we come to a conclusion that God could not exist because of X, Y, or Z. And there are many reasons for that. And it's usually a combination of several of those reasons.
Maybe I missed it, but I don't think there you mentioned intellectual. Like, were some of them intellectually committed to their atheism because of their research?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, among the demographic of atheists, they are generally higher educated and then view themselves as rationally superior. And so they think it is the most rational, reasonable thing to believe, atheism or naturalism.
In your book, you laid out a variety of catalysts that, for whatever reason, it made them open to considering. That's kind of what you said. I'd love for you to kind of lay them out and how it is they catalyze someone to being open to such a question that they're sometimes so committed to not considering.
Right. Yeah. For me, that was the $1 million question. If they're so closed off, what would it take for them to become open to even the possibility of considering something outside of naturalism, atheism? There was a very small minority, like 12%, who were open to the idea of God, weren't real resistant to it. But for the most part, most were settled. And think about it in your own life. It's like if things are going well, why change? And I found that it took some kind of disruptor in the status quo that causes them to stop and consider that possibly their own worldview isn't up to the task of handling whatever it is in front of them that they're facing or considering or having dissonance about. One of the first disruptors was what I call a longing, like an intellectual longing. This intellectual longing is particularly among those who are very thoughtful, critical thinkers, scientists, engineers, philosophers, whatever. They'll begin to look at their own worldview and say, this doesn't explain, say, the origin of the universe or the origin of life or the beginning of consciousness or the fine-tuning of the universe. My worldview is not explaining those things in the way that I think it should. I need to look at this farther or closer or deeper. But that's usually a process. Again, it's internally driven over a period of time. There's also another intellectual kind of catalyst, and that's whereby someone comes and presents a challenge to them that they didn't think possible from, say, the Christian worldview. One of my favorite stories is a young man. He just brilliant. He made it a game of just tearing down Christians. He was the captain of his debate team. He had read all the existentialist authors by the time he was 14. He was convinced that naturalism was true, that nihilism was the result, and that he had to live in that reality. He met a PhD in philosophy who was the first person he said I could go toe to toe with. And so he was driven to start kind of a small group, if you will, a small discussion group weekly to discuss these very deep ideas from these, Kant and all this deep philosophy. He was finally able to work through the fact that the things that he held valuable, like aesthetics, beauty, truth, were not grounded in his own worldview. It wasn't like the Christian went up and, challenged him verbally to an intellectual debate. It was more that he could see that he was someone with whom he could have meaningful discussion. And at the end, he said, I just couldn't live with the fact that I'm not thinking and I'm not acting according to my own worldview. That's what it would be. So from an intellectual perspective, there are those catalysts, just internal longing or external challenge.
This came up over and over again in your book, interestingly, was that it was so often Christians just being Christians. Like, like as in this just an intellectual Christian who enjoys the philosophy. And that can lead to a particular catalyst for a particular atheist. I found that interesting. So were there other catalysts as well? Those, you kind of put those in the box of intellectual, but were there other ones?
Yeah, there was a different kind of longing, an existential longing for something more than their worldview offered. The crisis that comes through trying to self-create your own identity, your own purpose, and there's a lot of lostness in that. And even for the atheist, there's self-created meaning, but at the end of the day, it's something self-generated. And it's not something lasting or longing or truly objectively purposeful for anything, greater that will last. And so for about a third of them, they felt like they reached a point where their life was just empty. There's a story at the very end, and I don't know if you've read it, it's the last story, it's probably my favorite, of a man who was so bent on atheism, found his intellectual home in atheism, as a mocker, kind of berater of Christians and Christianity, and was going to live life to the full the way that he wanted to live it. Actually ended up marrying a Christian and seeing his wife and her simple family just have incredible joy and peace and kindness and generosity in their lives. He said, by the time I got to my 30s, he was like, what is all this work and this toil for? It's like building a sandcastle on the sand and then knowing that the tide's just going to come wash it away. What's the point? What's the purpose? But in this particular case, he opened himself to the possibility of it, and God showed up kind of in an extraordinary way that was convincing for him. one of those spiritual experiences again. Now, you had mentioned too the way that Christians show up, that can be very catalytic, I guess, in terms of someone's journeying. Sometimes that happens when a crisis occurs in someone's life. That can be very unsettling, right? If your own worldview is not, providing whatever it is you need in that crisis moment, you become open to other perspectives, and including, the possibility of God. There's a beautiful story of a woman named Nikki, Jewish atheist, secular intellectual in Portland, who loved just conversing with her intellectual friends and their discussions. And they thought that religion was just the nemesis, especially Christianity. And she had a serious health crisis, and none of her intellectual friends showed up. But this sweet woman named Mary came and ministered to her and cared for her. And Nikki said, all I really wanted at that moment was love. And that's what this woman brought. And then she ended up having also a spiritual experience that convinced her that Jesus was actually real. But it was the crisis point that opened her, changed her circumstance, made her open to other, situations and perspectives. There's been a study done that I referenced in my book by Gunther, who talks about the social distancing that has nothing to do with COVID, but just where you find yourself in relationship to people of other worldviews, and that atheists or non-believers often find themselves completely disconnected to Christians. And so that lack of exposure to any kind of authentic form of Christianity causes someone then to build a vision in their head based upon caricatures that are fed through film and art. And then when you finally encounter someone who is very different than what you thought they were, these disarming witnesses, whether it's love or intellect or a full and meaningful life, sometimes can be very unsettling to the disbeliever or the non-believer.
Was spiritual experiences also itself a catalyst that you had paid attention to? Was that another one, or I feel like there's maybe one or two more?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, the spiritual experience. Yeah, we had kind of touched on that before. That was, again, very surprising. There were only like 16% at the very early stage where someone encounters something with God. There's a story in there of a woman who was a college professor, very, I guess, left leaning, I guess you could say, in her ideology, had no need for God. She was a good person. She felt she just lived her life. And she had an unexpected dream. She wasn't looking for God. She wasn't calling out for God. She just had a dream that she, as this, who she thought as a good person, encountered the holiness of God. She said it made me feel the filth of the billions of cells in my body. So she felt her own unholiness as contrasted to his holiness, but also at the same time, his amazing love and forgiveness. So she came out of that dream. Now, these dreams aren't like normal dreams. They're like qualitatively different, let's just say. She came out of that dream wanting to go find Jesus. So at the catalytic point, there were certainly some that disrupted and turned them in another direction.
That's interesting, because often this conversation is presented as though it is simply an intellectual battlefield. And I think these stories at least show that there's a lot more going on than just who has the more rigorously defended deductive argument. There's more to it than that. But also in your research, you're really clear to say that these catalysts themselves were just that. They kind of opened someone up and they led them into a different phase where they were willing to consider things, but they were not themselves like a conversion experience to Christianity. So I'm really glad we took all the time to look at those catalysts, but what moved them further down the road toward Christ?
Again, every journey's different, but it depended on their personality in a sense. If someone was really quite cerebral, their automatic go-to would be, start reading apologetics philosophy, start listening to debates, start considering intelligent discussion about these ideas, that would definitely be a part of their journeying, because they made it very clear that they would not believe unless they believed it was true. So some of that had to do with opening the Bible. They would just start reading the Bible, and so many were just completely dumbfounded by what they found. I know there are many in the doubting world that have trouble with some of the hard passages and that kind of thing. But, what's interesting is when I talked to these people, none of that ever came up. Isn't that interesting? What seemed to be happening is when I asked them how they approached the Bible or what they found, were they surprised? They were almost befuddled by what they found because, again, most of them had never really read it for themselves, which is different perhaps from a Christian deconstructing. But for those who had had no personal reading of the scripture, it was almost overwhelming for some. They would become voracious readers. They would find, wow, this is not just pie in the sky fairy tale like I thought. It's not just moral platitudes. This is space-time history. These are real events. These are intelligent people. Jesus was an amazing person, wise, courageous, and bold. And one guy said he would just throw down with the Pharisees, and he was so impressed by that. It just seemed to be surprise. But I would often ask them, how do you know that the Bible was true? Did you do any research on the reliability of the text? And some did. Not everyone. I think they were so bowled over by many times what they found. Also, trying church. Only about half of the people even attended any kind of a church before conversion. A lot of them, because of the nature of atheism, the exposure would be debilitating for them if anyone knew that they were pursuing Christianity. But about half of them, for different reasons, tried church. Again, those walls started coming down and relative to meeting Christians and seeing what this was all about. It's not as strange or weird or stupid. It was a process of really breaking down negative stereotypes and building up the plausibility of who Christians were, what Christianity is, who God is, what this is all about. There's a subchapter heading in my book called Where There's Not a Will, There's Not a Way. But once someone becomes willing and becomes honest in their searching, it's amazing what they find.
I think you said somewhere in your book that never shelved the intellectual for people. It was never like, well, this is enough. I like this community. I feel good when I read the Bible, so I'm in. It seemed like you really said that there was always that intellectual part. No one ever shelved that as they were in their searching phase.
I'm so glad that you said that, really, because all these other functional things, the things that make religion or Christianity work for someone, that are meaningful for their own lives, and those were door openers. Those sustained. But the intellectual journeying increased over time to where by the time someone came to a point of belief, it was something like 98% had some kind of a strong intellectual journeying. Again, they had to be convinced that it was true or they wouldn't believe it. If they came to a place of belief and conversion through a powerful spiritual experience, which some did, and they had not done their intellectual due diligence prior to that experience, they just knew God was real because of that powerful experience with God, then they would do their intellectual due diligence after that experience because they were essentially skeptical by nature. That aspect of them doesn't change.
And in your book, you actually differentiated intellectual assent from conversion. Please modify this if I'm not presenting it correctly, but it's almost like you have people's commitment to their atheism, and then there were these catalysts, and then there was a truth-seeking phase, and then it almost felt like at some point there was even an intellectual assent phase. But even at that point, that's different from an actual conversion experience.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Just because you believe something is true doesn't mean that you want to put your trust in it. It makes me think of the story of Peter Byrom. He's a young man from the UK, and he was a Christian growing up, left his faith at college. He was living with an atheist who became a Christian and another Christian who became an atheist. So they were having interesting discussions.
Sounds like it.
None of that was convincing for him. He wanted to live life the way that he wanted to live life. So you're talking about the volitional will there. He said, I had sincere doubts and insincere motives. There were some sincere doubts. There were things that he just couldn't wrap his mind around intellectually, but he had a reason to disbelieve apart from that. And so over time, he had really become invested in the work of Richard Dawkins, who was really, was the height of the new atheists. And Richard would, he's in London. And so is this young man. And there was a forum there where William Lane Craig had invited Richard Dawkins to come and debate, and he wouldn't come. That was very disconcerting for him. And so eventually he came to see the works of William Lane Craig and get more into apologetics. So he became intellectually convinced, but he said, but I didn't want to believe. I mean, I believed intellectually, he said, but I really wasn't ready to become a Christian, because to become a Christian, as you know, it's a whole life transformation. It's not just checking a box. Okay, I believe now and I can live any way that I want. No, there are demands on your life. So that means laying down some of your own will and desires. And he admittedly, it took him a while. In fact, he had an interesting conversation with William Lane Craig's wife, Jan. He was saying, I believe it, but, and she said, if you're not willing to be all in, don't do it. And so there's a counting of the cost for conversion. I mean, it really is a giving up of yourself, just as Christ gave him up for you. And it's an exchange in a sense. It is a gift, but it is a new allegiance. It's a new life. It's a new way of thinking and living.
It was interesting. I feel like you touched on that in your book, that I can't keep all the names straight. You know them better, and I'm not even sure they're the real names, so it doesn't matter. But
yeah, they're not.
Yeah, I figured as much.
Yeah.
One individual was saying something about they wanted to live their life the way that they wanted. It's obviously something we can all relate to. But they were saying that they weren't finding meaning and purpose in that. And so it was, in a sense, a risk or a giving of something up to say, I'm going to live my life how I want. But he was finding such deeper meaning and purpose in faith that he was willing to make that trade.
Yes.
Doing what you want does not mean you will find meaning and purpose in life. And I suppose in a way we're drawing on this idea that Christianity is not simply true, but it is also good and beautiful. And I think our culture is having a harder and harder time identifying the good and beautiful aspects of Christianity. And so when the intellectual side just doesn't feel appealing, then it's easy to go, well, even if it is true, how do I even really want it? Thank you for taking so much time to lay out your research. That was a lot of you sharing, but I'm really glad you did. On page 160 of your book, you did kind of lay out a physical drawing of this kind of model, I guess you could say, or kind of the framework. Do you think it would be helpful for a listener for you to actually discuss that, or do you think we've kind of talked about the elements of that enough that we could just leave it and move on kind of to the more application side?
In a nutshell, I think the conversion is really changing from one story of living and being to another. And it really is a full transformation. It is not just mere affiliation to a church or just checking the box on Sunday, but what Christianity is meant to be. It should change every aspect of your life internally. Even the secular academics will acknowledge that change. They just call it biographical reconstruction. But I do want to say it was a challenge, but it was a fun challenge laying this out visually as a visual person.
Christians who are not doubting and maybe doubting Christians might be listening and trying to, find the thing that is going to create faith for them. And I don't think that the research you've presented offers that kind of, simple formula for if you do these things, then you will help generate faith in atheists or in yourself. That being said, though, do you think that there are things that they could take away from your work that could help them as they journey?
Yeah, I think it's okay to wrestle. I think we're meant to wrestle. Faith in and of itself infers or implies that you don't know everything. Truth is, we don't have to know anything with certainty. I think that's why several of those that I've spoken with say, if I ever find something else that this isn't true, I'll move in that direction. You want to go where the evidence leads. There's a sense in which if you are a truth seeker, you will follow that. If truth is on the side of the Christian worldview, it will be found. These people were intensely seeking after truth. If anybody is kind of doubting, Stephanie Ruper is an interesting podcast story that I've had recently, and she talked about this struggle that she had between not knowing everything and yet, almost in that Kierkegaardian way, taking a leap. There has to be this willingness to embrace God on what you do know and not what you don't know. One of the very first classes that I took in Christian apologetics, we were in this room, and it was one of the very first lectures. And he talked about the cumulative case for Christianity. And I thought, what in the world is that? I have no idea. As you know, the more you know, the more you don't know. You're never going to arrive in a place of being all knowing. Only God is. But I came to appreciate the fact that when I look at reality, for me, all of reality points to God. Now, are there things that I don't understand? There's mostly I don't understand. And there are a lot of things that I question. But there are a lot of things that I know to be true. Now, I said, I know you can't know everything, but there are some things you can know. And I think people make this mistake is that, say, for example, one experience will happen in their life and they reject God. But I'm like, well, what about all these other things? What about the fact that you have human dignity and value, that you can say something's right or wrong? Yes, that part over there is giving a lot of trouble. And as someone who has had a great deal of trouble in my life, let's just say disappointment, heartache, difficulty, you can take that one thing and you can generalize that to the whole and make that all and dismiss. And that's what people have a tendency to do rather than sitting back and looking at the whole picture. It's like having a puzzle, and yeah, some of the important pieces are missing or they're damaged or something's wrong with them. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the picture isn't making sense and it's good. I'm a painter. I see things in very, very broad brush strokes. So I have a tendency to look at the whole, and maybe it's easier for me to do that, but I know what it feels like to be emotionally damaged and hurt in significant ways. But you have a choice. Dallas Willard says, if you think God doesn't exist, then you won't seek him because you don't think he exists. Now that sounds kind of circular, but it makes sense to me. I wanted to say, sit back and look at the whole and don't let the doubt overwhelm you, because there's so much there. All of reality points to God. Sometimes we don't like it, we don't understand it, but there is a lot, like you say, that's good and beautiful and true that we can see if we allow ourselves to. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think it makes actually perfect sense. I'm trying to put it to words. It's almost like you're saying it's not that it always makes sense of every single moment. You're a painter, as you said, like almost use that. It's like if you zoom in too close on one little piece of paint, it almost like there's no sense in this. But it's like you're saying as you pull out, you see the whole painting. It does make sense within the whole frame of everything, and that makes sense even with doubters. Like I had a friend I was talking to this week who's wrestling with doubt. And I did kind of ask that question. I was like, but you've had like some religious experiences in the past. And he was like, oh yeah, I have. But in his moment of doubt, that felt hard to recall. That he was like, no, you're right. Like I have had experiences. I felt very confident of those and I still do, but it just felt faint in the moment. But that broader picture brought maybe some stability in the moment that, right now something's happening that's causing doubt, but there is a bigger story that I'm part of here.
Yeah,
So I actually think
right.
that that's very helpful. Have you found that your research strengthened your faith in the process of doing it? I will just say personally, as I was reading it, it kind of fired me up. But have you found for yourself or more generally that this has helped strengthen people's faith?
I would say yes. As an observer of all of these stories, the particular ones in the research, they're very bright. 7 held PhDs, 43%, I think, had graduate degrees. They are, for the most part, critical thinkers who would not believe a lie. They knew it to be a lie. People I highly respect. And again, as an onlooker, watching these people forsake their past life for what they could not deny. It's like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And their diligent search was so inspiring to me that I know that they have covered, as scientists, as philosophers, and as apologists, as just thinkers, that they could cover so much more ground so broadly and so much more deeply than I ever could. That, of course, was very affirming for my own faith. It helped me to know that this really is true. As far as how I think it's impacting others, I'm humbled to say that, well, a man contacted me 3 months ago, a man who is older, he's extremely wealthy, but he's had everything the world had to offer. He's tried Christianity before in his life, but he gave it up because he didn't think it was real. He pursued other paths, other possible religions. He couldn't find anything, thought he would give Christianity one more chance. So he opened himself up for truth seeking. He found me through Cybe Stories podcast, where former atheists and skeptics tell their stories. I think he had listened to 20 or 25 by the time he got to me, because he was interested in their journeying. He started reading intensely and gave his life to Christ like 3 weeks ago. So, and I hear these stories, and I know that we can all look at the journeying of others and really be affirmed that perhaps this is true and good and beautiful and worth believing.
I mean, I certainly will recommend to listeners both your book and your podcast, because I enjoy listening to the podcast as well. It is always encouraging. Was there something you wanted to share that I didn't create space for? Or is there something more generally about your work that you just don't get to talk about, but you want to? I know what that's like. You always have these thoughts swirling around, but when you're interviewing, you don't always get to talk about what you want to. So I just really want to give you an open floor to express anything you think would be important to the conversation we've had, or your work more generally. So the floor is yours.
Well, Matt, first, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's always, again, humbling to talk about my work. I just don't get that much opportunity to do it, but when I do, it's really such a blessing, because when you invest so many years of your life into something, it's so encouraging when somebody wants to actually hear what you have to say. I think if anybody has heard anything, they've heard that conversion stories, doubt, deconstruction, our own lives, it's complex, it's complicated, it's not easy belief. But if I could say anything really to encourage your listener, is just to remain open to the person of Christ. Really just fix your eyes upon him. Gosh, because he loves you and he wants you to know the love that he has for you. So don't give up, because it's extraordinary when you actually really find that deep love of God.
You can find more conversations with Dr. Harmon on Side B Stories podcast. And as always, if you have something to add, don't hesitate to reach out via email or on social media. Until next time.